Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's presentation. I want to thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us here for about a half an hour or so. We're going to talk about the retirement income mindset and really an overview of the RMA curriculum, the RMA program, the certification. I think it's extremely important. There's so much opportunity right now to add value as an advisor for your retirement clients. There's so many things that have been disrupted, and there's so many things that your retirement clients are worried about that I think you can add an extreme amount of value, and I'll get into that here in just a second. My name is Devin Eckberg. I'm Chief Learning Officer, Managing Director of Professional Development for the Investments and Wealth Institute. I've met many of you before, and again, just want to thank you for taking some time out. A couple of little housekeeping things. If you notice your GoToWebinar dashboard, there's a couple of areas that might be of interest for you. There's a handout section that you can download the PowerPoint slides that I'll be using today. Feel free to download those and use those as you see fit. There's also a question section and a chat section. If you want to send me a question, I'm happy to answer that. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation today. And the chat window is available for you to chat amongst yourselves as an audience. So we like to see questions and interactions and other comments in that chat window, and I'll be trying to monitor that as well. I'm going to try to keep this to about 30 minutes or so, but I'm also available to take questions as a Q&A after some of the content that I've got prepared for you. So I think it's time to go ahead and get started and move along. Now, if you're not familiar with the Investments and Wealth Institute, we're a professional membership association. We're mostly known for the certifications that we administer. So if you're familiar with CIMA, the investment management credential, the CPWA, which is more of a private wealth, high net worth, ultra high net worth type wealth management credential. And then RMA is actually a relatively new credential to us. We just acquired it about 3 years ago from another association that has been developing this for the last decade and more. And it's really done, I think, the right way. I think it's a mixture of, very research-based, evidence-based, academic type thinking, but there's a lot of practical application in here. And I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of, I think, some of the most important and intriguing parts of the program, especially now as we start thinking about retirement income and how really inseparable that conversation is from retirement risk. So you'll actually notice that my content and remarks here today are actually more focused around retirement risk, but I'll kind of tie that into retirement income today for you to kind of make sure that you understand the mindset that we think about when we think of a framework to address retirement risk. Not going to talk about any products today. I'm not going to talk about annuities or bonds or other kind of income producing assets and whatnot, but I want to give you a framework that you can think about in terms of what your clients are thinking about and what they're worried about, what's keeping them up at night in terms of retirement income. But it's actually, they're really more worried about the liability side of the balance sheet, more the risks that they're taking. So the big thing that I want to kind of make sure that you understand is that I think this is an area that you can differentiate yourself and really stand out from other advisors. So if you're worried about your value proposition or justifying your fees as an advisor, this is actually a pretty good way to do it, which is, again, taking the client's mindset, understanding fully what they are worried about, and developing a repeatable, actionable plan that they really feel comfortable with and they're bought into and really designed from their perspective. And that's not easy in the retirement space today. The retirement industry, there's a lot of different segments going on. You've got insurance advisors, you've got wealth advisors, you've got other investment type oriented managers and things like that. There's not really a unified retirement advisor sort of segment out there, and that's very difficult because when it's so segmented like that, a lot of advisors unfortunately really take their industry's approach to retirement management. And then, for example, an insurance advisor is going to take a very different approach than maybe a more investment-oriented type advisor. And clients have a hard time kind of making sense of that. So I think one of the powerful things of the program that we offer is really taking a step back from the industry segmentation and looking at what what really matters to clients. And like I said, I think this is an opportunity for you to differentiate yourself as an advisor. And I think it's important because it starts with understanding, what do retirement clients value? And like I said before, they're really, when they say they're worried about retirement income, that's probably partially true. What they're mostly concerned about are their retirement liabilities. Where are their risks? That's what's really kind of making them nervous. And you'll notice that when they communicate to you that they're worried about running out of money, right? For instance, they're worried about not being able to maintain their lifestyle. They're worried about the risks that are associated with retirement. They just want to know that they're okay. And the retirement income is really, ought to be viewed through that lens, and ought to be viewed from a mindset of goals-based type planning, and that income solves a particular need or want that they actually have. Not necessarily the dollar figure, but they know that that risk and that income is inseparable. So I want to kind of start out with just a few key points from the RMA curriculum, and specifically around risks, because in the financial industry, we have a lot of different terminology for risks, right? Volatility, standard deviations, all this sorts of stuff. Risks are often expressed in the form of probabilities, right? Like, that's really standard deviation. At the mathematical level, that's really what it's trying to explain. But for most people, and I would say for almost all people, probabilities are actually less important than the consequences and exposure to those particular risks. For instance, humans don't really think in terms of probability very well. I'll give you an example. We all know how casinos work, right? You walk into a casino, you obviously know the probabilities of winning any one of these games is not in your favor, right? It's designed that way. So the probabilities are not great, but people still tend to play these games. But what if I told you that there was a table in this casino that actually had pretty good probability that you win? So let's say it's a binary outcome, you win or you lose. There's no difference between the two, there's no other alternative outcomes. And you have about an 83% chance of winning the hand, and you have about a 16-17% chance of losing that hand. How many of you, by the way, and there is a little feature that you can raise your hand here, but how many of you would play that table given those probabilities? I see a bunch of hands because you guys are degenerate gamblers, I'm sure. No, I'm just joking. There's a bunch of people would play that game, right? But you're really only looking at the probabilities. You're not looking at the consequences or your exposure to your loss. What if I told you that game was Russian roulette? If you think about it, you have a 5 in 6 chance of winning, right? That's about 83% if I do my math right. And you have about a 16 or 17% chance of losing, but the consequences and exposure to losing are very severe, right? So those of you that raised your hand, how many of you would play that game? And how many of you would play that all night, like some of you may have thought previously? Probably not. So that's just a key point that's very intuitive, but all the research and products that are built out there really only kind of look at the probability side of things and not necessarily the consequences and exposure. I'll give you a little bit of a framework here in just a few minutes to kind of help understand and shape and look at risks differently, almost kind of like a clinical diagnosis of risk, the same way a doctor might diagnose your particular risk. So taking a step back and you just think about all the retirement risks that are out there, there's a lot. There's, you can define these risks in a number of different ways. One of my favorite places to go is the Society of Actuaries. They do a ton of work on retirement risks. They actually, this document here is free for anybody that goes to their website and downloads it. It's called Managing Post-Retirement Risks, and they've identified, I think, about 160 different risks and categorized them. They do a great job of sort of addressing each of those risks. That's a lot. And it's almost so many risks that it's almost kind of unmanageable. I mean, imagine giving your client a pamphlet of risks, like there's like 160 of them that they have to worry about retirement. That'll drive you crazy, and you'll probably end up losing your client, frankly. But what I actually like about this document is that it takes a specific risk and it gives you some background. I like this framework. It gives you some background. It tries to predict, the outcome of how severe this risk might be. It gives you some suggestions on how to manage that risk potentially, and then kind of gives you additional comments. I actually really like that as a framework, and it's partially the way that the RMA program sort of categorizes risks a little bit. So let me take a step back and just say that 160 risks is way just too many. So what the RMA curriculum tries to do is narrow it down to something that's a little bit more manageable, because when you look at those 160 risks, some of them are actually kind of the same risk, but expressed in a different way. And so you can actually categorize these risks. The RMA curriculum narrows it down to about 9 or 10 that I think is a little bit more manageable in terms of communicating to your clients, but then also developing a portfolio that solves for these types of risks. But what you can do is actually kind of further categorize these risks. So they're not just 9 or 10 sort of abstract risks that are out there and impossible to solve. You can actually start categorizing them a little bit differently. So some of these are systematic, which affect all households just in general in most cases. And then there's more kind of unsystematic risks that are really more unique to individual households. So an example of that is a spending risk, for instance. A consumption risk is something that they might call it, where one household is completely different than the other in terms of what their needs are in managing that spending risk over time. But in general, there's a bunch of other risks that really are universal to all households: market risk, credit risk. I won't spend too much time getting into the definitions of these, but you can kind of see how even just starting to kind of categorize these risks make it much easier for you to communicate to your clients and make it more relatable. We're not just talking probabilities here. Now we're talking about really the consequences of these and what individual exposure is. And I have a little bit more to say about that sort of stuff. But the whole point here in trying to categorize these risks, and this is where it ties into retirement income, is that you ought to have a place in your portfolio that specifically addresses these retirement risks, whether it's a portfolio construction or an income product or whatnot. It's important to tie these risks to the goals that your clients have. It's a goals-based framework. Now, at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see words that we use that are a little bit unique to the RMA curriculum, but these concepts aren't unique. If you're familiar with a goals-based framework, these are very simple. So, you're talking about an upside portfolio, which is more of kind of an aspirational type portfolio you might hear. There's a flooring mechanism, which is really just kind of covering some of the essential needs, the day-to-day living expenses and consumption that your clients have. That's kind of what we mean. But you'll notice how those risk management allocations are built into the portfolio to address specific needs. So the flooring portfolio, or the essentials portion of the portfolio, are really designed to address things like some public risk, like inflation, for instance, or policy risk, meaning something, maybe your taxes are expected to go up or whatnot. And so you're using products that support the goal portion of that portfolio, but it's inseparably tied to the risks that you're trying to manage there. Does that make sense? Because if you just talk about retirement income from let's say a longevity perspective or a floor perspective, that can be very abstract. As soon as you tie it into a risk, it immediately clicks for those clients. It's just a much easier conversation for you to have, but then you're also getting your clients buy-in to it. They understand why I have a floor, and they understand why that floor is addressing certain types of risks that they're worried about. You'll notice there's one there for longevity as well, which is a huge problem in retirement. And there's some great products out there, insurance products, annuity products, things like that can solve for that. And the retirement income portion of that solves a particular need, makes it easier for you to communicate to your clients. So let me kind of take another step back here, because I mentioned it earlier, where your job as an advisor is almost to diagnose your clients like any physician would. And here's a really valuable sort of risk diagnosis framework that you can use. The curriculum obviously goes into much more detail on this, but I think this is very powerful. So first of all, from a client's point of view, a risk is really only relevant if it involves an identifiable hazard. I'm not talking about abstract stuff. I'm talking about very specific hazards and getting very specific. And I'll give you an example of that here in just a second. Number two is if the client even has exposure to that hazard in the first place, right? Think about a client or a physician that may have a patient that's trying to solve for something that they're scared of or don't understand, and they don't even have any exposure to it at all. That really matters whether the client has a specific exposure to that risk or not. And then finally, you got to get into the consequences. Are they so severe for the client that they have to be solved, or are they they're not, the consequences are so maybe small that they potentially could ignore them, and that may be okay. They may make a conscious decision to ignore some of those because the consequences are so small. And then finally, we talk about probabilities because they're still important. But again, humans don't think well in probabilities, like that example I gave you earlier, but they still are important. But notice that it's sort of the last feature of this framework is to discuss the probabilities, that the hazard itself, their exposure, and their consequences, I think, are much more important. So kind of keep this framework in mind. I'm going to kind of walk you through an example of how we might analyze a specific risk using this framework. So here's an example. There's right now, given the COVID crisis and the financial crisis that's evolved from it, I think personally, public policy risk is something that's quite large right now. And what I mean by public policy risk is I want to get very specific about it. What is if I'm going to identify the hazard, how specific can I get? So notice the hazard here. I'm going to just be very specific. I think there's going to be potentially, for some clients, an increase in taxes. And even more specifically, what type of taxes? Well, income taxes might increase, property taxes. The municipal balance sheets right now look pretty severe. So if you have a client that lives in, I'm not going to pick on a state, but lives in Illinois, for instance, and their balance sheet as a municipality looks a little bit scary, these guys have a huge potential hazard in terms of an increase in future taxes, right? But somebody that maybe lives in another municipality who's got a little bit healthier balance sheet may not quite have that type of exposure. There may be new taxes, consumption taxes. I've heard some politicians talk about VAT taxes. I just want to get really specific about what we're talking about here in terms of a specific hazard. We've heard some politicians talking about a reduction in Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, Medicaid, things like that. That can certainly impact your clients. We've heard things about means testing Social Security, so maybe not an outright elimination of those benefits, but certainly a means testing might be something that we have to be concerned about. And healthcare reform, right? So I'm getting very specific about what I mean by public policy risk. And I've listed out a few examples here. Some of that might resonate with your client greatly, and some of them might not resonate that much. And then finally, like I told you, the exposure, moving on, the exposure is going to be very different for a client. Somebody that has, residency in a certain area or whatnot, somebody whose age and wealth is maybe different. There, you really got to kind of hone in on that individual client's exposure to it. And then finally, the consequences for any of these, hazards that we've just identified can be a significant reduction in income, right? So if you're projecting in the future that your clients will have X dollars of Social Security and those are cut, that can cut into that income side. And for on the other side, expenses and other things, healthcare expenses and other things like that might rise. So you've got kind of this reduction of income, you've got this increase in expenses or some combination of both. And those consequences in most cases can be quite severe, right? And it's like I said, it's Russian roulette level consequences potentially for some. It's the difference between a successful retirement plan and a not successful retirement plan where they're eating cat food, for the remainder of their life. So that can be extremely high. And then the probabilities, finally, we're just talking about the probabilities. Look, I would put personally that the probabilities of something like this happening in some form is pretty high. You may disagree with that, actually. For example, a case could be made that some of these hazards will require a huge sort of majority of politicians coming together and agreeing on something like that. Like actually introducing a VAT, for instance, would actually take a huge political effort to enact. And so some people might actually say, well, the chances of it are being low. Like, we're so divided right now, I don't think they could come together and implement any of this stuff. So there's a case to be made that the probabilities are quite low. I personally think that they're high, but it's all I'm saying is there's no correct answer here, but you definitely want to get your client's input, because your client may be very concerned about it and think that the probability is really high, and therefore their plan ought to address it so that they can sleep at night. Does that make sense? So don't worry about being right or wrong, but use it as a gauge to understand where your client's mindset is so that you can prepare with the proper portfolio or products or whatnot to kind of handle that. Does that make sense? I hope so. There's even maybe an additional framework if you want to get really detailed about this and try to understand what the range of consequences might be. Not a particular consequence, but maybe a range of those. You know, when we talk about uncertainty right now in the retirement space, what people really get scared of is uncertainty. And right now, uncertainty is at a very high level because there's a really wide range of things that could happen, right? So getting a handle on what the range of potential scenarios and consequences are, even if you're not really making a step towards solving it, actually just identifying the range can actually be very soothing for people. So from a behavioral perspective, understanding the range of consequences could actually be super helpful. Let's talk about how predictable it is. What kind of milestones or signposts would you see to lead you into, you know, saying, okay, I can predict this with some confidence that this is going to happen, and discuss those signposts along the way so when they happen, you can actually communicate that to your client and say, hey, remember we said this might happen? It's happening, and here's the action that we're going to take. And then, you know, let's talk about the methods that we're going to use to address this. Is this something that I'm just going to manage myself? Is it something that I'm going to try to hedge or maybe transfer that risk to somebody else through an insurance product? What are the pros and cons of each of these methods? And if you can get your clients talking about this, think about it. You know, if your client is sitting down to dinner with their friends or family or colleagues or whatever, and they start talking about their retirement plan, and they start talking about the pros and cons of each of these different scenarios, think how valuable that's going to be for you as an advisor. Because now your client's talking to their friends in these terms, and their friends are like, wow, this blows my mind. You guys have an awesome plan. Those friends and colleagues are going to end up being your clients, because it's a really, really powerful thing to get your clients so bought into their financial plan that they're, I don't know, maybe even bragging about it to their friends and colleagues over dinner. And then finally, we talk about the products that are available to kind of address that risk. Notice that I didn't lead with the products. Okay, I think that's a mistake that I think is all too common in the advisory space, is to start with the products that you're, you know, if you're affiliated with a firm or industry, that your products, you know, matter to your compensation and things like that. That shouldn't be what you lead with. That's actually only after you've discussed all of the different trade-offs that are available. And then finally, you know, you do have to have a discussion about what are you going to do with this risk? Am I going to try to manage it myself through my portfolio? Am I going to retain that risk and you know, maybe budget for it? Or am I going to pass that risk on? And I don't have time to get into this so much, but this is exactly what, say, an insurance company's analysis would do. Is the risk, is it a high frequency risk? Is it a very high severity of risk? And the combination of how often it happens and how severe it is depends on how they manage that risk internally as an insurance company. So that's I think it's a very valuable piece of the curriculum to really kind of have that decision-making framework going forward, okay? So I wanted to kind of give you that overview of the retirement income mindset is actually more of a retirement risk mindset. And the income and the form of income needs to address a specific risk in mind, and it needs to be very detailed. The hazard needs to be identified, needs to understand what the exposure is and what the consequences are. And if the probabilities are so high that it makes that combination super relevant, that's where you can add most of the value as you're developing this plan. So I want to take a second here. Hopefully that was good. I didn't see any questions that kind of came in, so hopefully that made sense to you. But if you have questions, feel free to push those out to me, and I'm happy to answer them. So I've talked about the RMA certification. My favorite thing about it is that there are very practical frameworks, like the one I just kind of demonstrated to you a second ago, not only about risk, but also how to construct those goals-based portfolios. There's a whole map of decision-making processes that you can go through that are very friendly to whichever industry segment that you're in and all the regulations that you might be under. So that's what I really like about it, is it's very practical, but it's also academically based. It's research based. There are legitimate frameworks that are backed up by the data that work. So let me kind of talk about the certification here a little bit. Question came in: what's the cost for the course and the certification? I promise I'll cover that. So this is a certification that focuses on building custom retirement income plans to mitigate clients' risk as they approach retirement, and then once they are in retirement, to monitor their plan. Okay, so this is not a senior designation, like some may be familiar with that term. It's not necessarily for people in retirement, although it's certainly useful. It's actually most useful for people who are approaching retirement and may actually have time to make adjustments before retirement to actually maximize what they get out of retirement. So that's just kind of a key point. The typical time commitment that people go through is about 4 to 6 months. We've seen people complete it earlier than that, and we've seen people take longer than that, but that's on about average about 4 to 6 months. And there's some statistics here that basically point out that this is a very important thing for clients to understand, and it's an important thing for advisors to help their clients understand. So the market is out there, and personally speaking, I think I'm seeing the demographics in the U.S. move in such a direction that I think this is going to be important for the next several decades as people approach retirement age. And quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are very unprepared for it. The biggest takeaways, I think, from the RMA program are this. One is that you learn a multidisciplinary approach to retirement planning. This is not just an insurance program. It's not just an investment program. It's not just a wealth management program. There's different industry segments that come together, and I think it's consistent across the way. That's actually a really good question that just popped up, is what type of demographics are there regarding the careers of people who have the RMA designation? For example, financial advisors or other industry professionals like wholesalers and other DCIO type relationships. Personally, I think this is relevant to most segments. So if if your industry is, let's say you're, a retirement plan sponsor, I think understanding what the needs of the end client are as you're constructing a plan for a sponsor, I think is super important. If you have individual clients, families, high net worth, ultra high net worth, or even just kind of affluent or mass market, I think this is critical almost for any of those types of advisors. If you're more of kind of a broker dealer and maybe you're licensed for insurance products and things like that, I think this is a huge opportunity for that type of segment to understand a holistic approach to retirement planning, not just necessarily the retirement portion of it. So David, that's maybe not a great answer, but I think it's relevant to all of those different segments that are out there. And by the way, we've seen a huge level of interest from all of those different segments. So our wirehouse advisors, all of our independent RIAs, even our bank and trust affiliated advisors are finding this super valuable, and we're incorporating it into their corporate programs so that they can learn more and support them from that perspective. Wholesalers, by the way, if you're a wholesaler, imagine how valuable it is learning to communicate with advisors the same way they communicate to their clients, and sort of using that same language of retirement income products that solve specific risks. I think that would actually be a very valuable sales tool if you happen to be in a supporting professional in that industry. So that leads me to kind of number 2 here is you really do get a better understanding of the client's retirement mindset. It's different. Retirement is way different. Decumulation is very different than the accumulation mindset that most of us sort of got into the business to do in the first place. And then, exploring strategies and risk assessment and solutions, I think, is a powerful part of this program. You discover practical tools, techniques that you can use right off the shelf, and they're consistent with, the regulations that you might have to be under, and understanding the client situation. And then, of course, with any other program in our certification world, having professional guidelines and standards is a big part of it. We follow the Investments and Wealth Institute Code of Professional Responsibility, which I think is super, super important. I'm also going to kind of talk about, from the advisor perspective, we have found that this is actually a very good client acquisition tool. I think it's, like I said, it helps you sort of attract and retain those type of clients, because when you get them talking about these types of things, they naturally spread to their natural markets and kind of help bring in additional clients. And I think it targets an important market for you, which is those pre-retirees that ultimately need the most help, and frankly are the ones that you can help the most from an advisor perspective. And I think it differentiates you from, like, so let's say a CFP or some of the other retirement credentials that are out there that are really focused on either a very large segment of financial planning or only a small segment of the retirement planning. From a client perspective, they get to develop a very sophisticated plan that they fully understand and can stick with. That gives them confidence, which is not a bad thing in this particular environment, and just simply making better decisions, which I think is universal for all of our clients' needs. When you think about the program itself, it's organized into 4 different segments. You've got kind of this client diagnostic section, this kit, if you will, of strategies of understanding the household balance sheet, which is a big kind of the center of the RMA programming, household cash flows, the client planning process. Then it starts to get into that retirement risk framework that I kind of gave you a little bit of an introduction to. Then it starts kind of taking a toolbox of strategies that you can use to kind of build that goals-based framework, and then ultimately how to implement the plan and monitor the plan going forward. So that's kind of how the structure of the program is organized. But notice that it's all organized around the client, and I think that's just an important distinction. This basically says the same thing. This is just how it's organized, just kind of in kind of text form. For you to pursue a designation like this, you've got to have at least, there are some prerequisites. You got to have at least 3 years of relevant experience, financial planning experience, or in the financial services industry for that 3 years. You don't have to have, I get this question a lot, which is because we always position this program as a post-CFP credential. So if you're a CFP, this is really a nice logical next step if you want to just kind of focus on the retirement planning section. That doesn't mean that you have to have your CFP to pursue this. A lot of people do, but a lot of people don't. But you just got to have that 3 years of relevant experience. We do a background check. We got to make sure that there's no problems there. You haven't been in trouble too much or at all with any of the ethical issues that are out there. You'll have to complete our program, the course material, and an executive education program. We'll talk about that here in a second. And then of course you take an exam. Let me pause here for a second and just answer a couple of questions that are out here. One question is the program country specific, or does it apply equally for other countries like Canada? So the best way I would describe this is it's very international friendly. There are segments of it that are specific to like US based regulations and programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So there are some things in there. But everything is very universal when it comes to the decision-making framework. So I know Canada has very similar products like tax advantage types accounts, pension type funding, things like that. So all of those things are very relevant. You might have to deal with a couple of little US quirky things, but it's very friendly to international clients. And we're actually getting it on board with some of our Canadian advisors and their firms. Another question is, what are the annual ongoing dues from IWI, continuing education credits, and so forth? So the ongoing certification fee runs around $275, which is pretty standard for any credential that's out there. The CE requirement is 40 hours of CE for every 2-year cycle. So if you do the math, that's about 20 hours per year. Here's the cool thing. If you already have a certification with IWI, like you're a CIMA or CPWA, all of your CE counts for RMA as well. So it's not like you have to do 20 for one, 20 for another, and 20 for the other in a year. The 20 hours satisfies all of your CE. And for the most part, and I'd say probably on a 90% basis, the CE that qualifies for RMA also qualifies for CFP and CFA and some of your other credentials out there. So it's very friendly. So if you have a bunch of long letters after your name, like some people do, that's not going to be a huge level of effort to make that happen. Okay. A couple of other questions came in. I'll address here in just a second. Here's the process. There's 3 parts to it. There's an online course. I've seen people do it in a few weeks, and I've seen other people take it and spread it out over several months. But it's basically a combination of readings, recorded lectures, there's quizzes and activities, there's case studies. So it's very interactive as far as the course. It's very linear. So you just kind of go, there's not a whole lot of chasing textbooks and things like that around. It's pretty straightforward from there, and I think it's personally very well done. The next step is that there's a 2-day executive education program called the RMA Education Capstone. This is where we bring in university professors, we bring in practitioners, we do 2 full days of extensive context and discussion around the RMA curriculum. And this is very powerful. I'll show you some opportunities to do that. We've also now put, because of this the COVID crisis, we've actually put this online now as a set of recordings. So you can actually do this part virtually if you want to as well. But there are some upcoming opportunities to do it in person, especially if you value that networking piece over time. So yes, we are planning on doing in-person sections this year. The next opportunity, I think I have a slide for that actually. Before I go to that slide, the step 3 is the certification exam. It's 100 multiple choice questions. We give you 3 hours to do it. The pass rate is actually fairly high, and I think the exam will just only get harder from here on out. So now is a good time to do that. It's a challenging exam, but I don't think it's too overwhelming. The virtual capstone is available now. We've had some really good feedback on it so far, and we're continuing to update that and make that a really good experience. The in-person opportunities to do this exec ed program are one in December. So hopefully, a lot of the travel restrictions for you guys are lifted by then. That's in Hollywood, Florida, which is an awesome place to be in December, by the way. And then the next one after that is in 2021 in Seattle, and that's coupled with our annual conference experience. If you've ever been to one of our annual conferences before, these are awesome. We've got really big name speakers that come in for that one typically, and so that's a great opportunity for you as well. Or if you just want to bang it out, go ahead and do that online. Our RMA Capstone Faculty is something that we're really proud of. It's actually one of our highest rated programs that we do at the Investments in Wealth Institute. Some of these guys you'll recognize, like Michael Kitsis or Bob Powell, Dana Anspa. We've got university professors like Michael Guillemette and others, and then sometimes I'll even join in and do some of the faculty work as well. We always bring in special guests. I'll give you an example. We had to cancel our annual conference this year. Unfortunately, it was scheduled last week in Boston, but we would bring in people like Bob Merton, who's a Nobel Prize winner, does a lot of work on retirement-related projects. He was scheduled to be a special guest for that for us. So that's just an example of some of the faculty that we can arrange for this. And finally, if you want to have a discussion about whether this is the right type of education program for you or not, you can reach out to our staff. Natalia is easy to get a hold of and easy to work with, and she's very nice, by the way. You can talk to her. You can also call our customer care department. You can talk to any one of us at the Institute, and we're happy to answer those questions. And you're also welcome to reach out to me personally, and I'm happy to have those conversations with you as well. A couple of other questions that kind of came in. Are there testing centers nationwide locally for this test? And yes, well, let me rephrase that. We have an online proctoring service that you can use. So you can actually take the exam in the comfort of your own home, and it is proctored and monitored online. Some people think it's really cool. There's a person, through webcams that's watching you take the exam. Some people think it's a little bit creepy, but I think it's really cool. But they walk you through it. It's really simple. We've had a really good feedback on that process, and it makes it super easy, because a lot of those testing centers had to shut down recently as well, and so there's a big influx of test takers that they're trying to struggle to manage. And it may be a while before you can get into one of those testing centers. So do the online proctoring, or if you come to one of our in-person events, you can actually take the exam on site there as well. We usually have proctors available on that. So I think I answered all of the questions that came through. Happy to answer any additional ones. I've kind of gone over my time here a little bit. I didn't want to make this a big sales pitch or anything like that, but I wanted to give you at least thinking about how retirement risk and retirement income are really inseparable. And if you have a good, repeatable, actionable process, it can make all the difference in the world. From a practice perspective, it makes a lot of things a lot easier. I think it attracts the type of clients that you're interested in attracting. And overall, I think this program is done the right way. With all of the different craziness and like how fragmented the retirement industry is out there, I think this does a good job of bringing that together as a practical way to address some of the big challenges that we've got out there. And then last question, is the virtual available now? Could you actually get started right away? And the answer is yes, you can start today and do that. I failed to mention the price. The bundle of those 3 different sections, the course, the capstone experience, and the exam, runs about $2,500 for Institute members, a little bit more for non-members. That covers the cost of the actual membership into the program. There are scholarships available, and we have funded our scholarships very generously this year, given all the impact of things that are going on there. So if you want to reach out to us, we can give you all the information on how to apply for scholarships, and maybe see if you can bring some of that cost down, which is a pretty attractive thing overall. So thank you for taking some time again out of your busy schedule. I hope that was helpful. Even if you decide not to pursue the RMA as a credential, I hope just the education piece of it might just be valuable for you to go through and learn, and knock out some CE hours if you need them. So all you CFPs and whatnot, you can bang out all of your CE and earn a credential at the same time. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me personally as well, and hope you have a great day.